Let me tell you a story. Mud slicked every desperate man's boots in Oakhaven, but rot-gut whiskey couldn't cover the grim truth of the auction block. She stood up there shaking a fragile little bird lost inside a torn calico dress. 50 men roared, placing loud bets on if she would even survive the wagon ride up the pass. But Ezra did not laugh. He stepped up, slammed a heavy poke of gold dust onto the barrel, and stared down that whole brutal mob. What he told her next made the saloon drop dead silent. Now, Oakhaven was a frontier camp that felt like a genuine mistake. It clung to the Bitterroot Mountains like a bloated tick, built right out of rough-cut pine-deep mud, and men who had simply run out of better places to hide. Eliza Miller stood shivering on a busted apple crate right out front of the assayer office. Wind howled down from the high peaks, carrying the bitter threat of November snow that bit straight through her thin, worn-out calico dress. She was just 22, but the pale gray of her skin and the sharp angles of her shoulders made her look like a woman who had already lived a painfully long life. She held a balled-up, blood-stained handkerchief right to her mouth, stifling a wet, rattling cough. She was a debtor. Back east in Chicago, they called them indentured workers, but out here on the frontier, folks just called them cattle. The transport outfit paid her train fare from the city, promising her steady domestic work in a local hotel. That hotel had burned to the ground 3 days before she arrived. Now she owed the outfit $30, and the local magistrate was auctioning off the town's unclaimed women to settle up those debts. A crowd of 50 men stood in the deep muck, passing clay jugs of liquor and spitting dark streams of tobacco into the puddles. Most were hard rock miners. Some were loggers' fellows who needed a woman to scrub their dirty floors, boil their salt pork, and keep their beds warm through the freezing winter. "All right, boys," the fat auctioneer hollered out, sweating straight through his wool suit despite the bitter cold. "We got Eliza here. Good hips, quiet mouth. She owes $30 for passage. Who is starting?" A heavy silence fell over the muddy street, broken only by the howling wind and her muffled cough. Those men just stared with cold, hard, calculating eyes. They did not see a woman. They saw a pure investment, and she looked like a terrible one. "I will give you $5, hollered Silas Higgins, a trapper missing half his teeth. The auctioneer scowled. $5 barely covers her train ticket. Jeb, she ain't living to see the snow melt. Silas fired back, drawing a harsh, mean chorus of laughter from the ragged crowd. "Just look at her. She is spitting out her own lungs. I am doing this county a favor, taking the burial cost right off your hands. $5 and she can haul my water until she drops dead." Eliza squeezed her eyes shut. She did not cry. The brutal factory floors of Chicago had beaten the tears right out of her by the time she was 14. You and I both know the harsh reality of the frontier. She was going to die on a frozen mountain, working for a man who smelled like rotting meat. 50. The single word cut through the wind and the cruel laughter exactly like a rifle shot. The crowd parted fast. A man stepped out from the shadows of the mercantile awning. He was massive, easily 6'4", with shoulders wide as a blacksmith anvil. He wore a thick coat of cured elk hide, the fur collar framing a face that was weathered, bearded, and etched with deep, quiet frontier lines. His cold eyes were the color of slate. He did not carry himself with the drunken swagger of those miners. He moved with the terrifying silent grace of a mountain rock slide just waiting to happen. Old Ezra Cole walked right up to the auctioneer barrel. He never even glanced at the crowd. He set a heavy leather poke of gold down on the wood. It hit with a solid thud. Silas bristled up, stepping right forward. "She ain't worth half that, mountaineer. You're tossing away good gold. She can't birth, she can't chop wood. She's a stiff wind away from the grave." Ezra slowly turned his big head. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He just looked at Silas with a cold, dead stare that made the rough trapper take a slow, involuntary step backward. "Sold." The auctioneer stammered out, quickly sweeping that gold poke right into his coat before the mountain man could change his mind. He turned toward Eliza, grabbing her roughly by her frail arm. "All right, girl, get off the block. You belong to the big mountain man now. Do exactly as he says. Spread your legs when he tells you, and make sure his fire stays lit. Ezra's massive hand shot out. It was a sheer blur of motion, his thick fingers clamped tight around the auctioneer's wool collar, lifting that fat man a whole inch off the mud. The auctioneer gasped for air, his eyes bulging as the wool suit bit straight into his windpipe. Rule number 1, old Ezra said. His voice was a low, deep rumble that carried right over that dead, silent frontier crowd. He was not even looking at the auctioneer. He was looking directly at Eliza. You do not owe me a single damn thing. Ezra told her, his cold slate eyes locking onto her wide, terrified gaze. Not your body, and certainly not your hard labor. You eat when hungry and sleep when tired. You just survive. He released him. You and I know that changed everything. Let's step into this frontier town together. That auctioneer fell backward into the mud, gasping for breath, while Ezra faced the crowd with his jaw locked tight. Anyone in this town tries to tell you different, Ezra said quietly. You let me know. That muddy street went dead quiet. Those miners traded nervous glances. Out in Oak Haven, men bought women strictly for labor and beds. They looked at them like plows or mules, just tools to survive those bitter mountain winters. Ezra just dropped $50, a small fortune in gold dust for a dying girl, only to tell her she was free from labor. Those miners thought he was plumb crazy. Eliza just stood there shivering, staring at that giant in his elk-hide coat. Her hardened mind raced, looking for the trap. Men didn't drop $50 on a sick orphan just to give her rest. On the frontier, kindness was a trade. She knew that hard truth. What is the hidden price? She wondered, gripping her battered carpet bag. What is this man gonna do to me when we reach that lonely mountain? Come on, Ezra grunted, turning his back on that crowd. He didn't check if she was following him. He simply expected it. Eliza stepped off that wooden crate, her thin boots sinking deep into freezing mud, and trailed along in the shadow of that mountain man. Their first stop was the local mercantile. Ezra never bothered asking if she needed a thing. He took one sharp look at her blue lips and shaking hands, then marched her straight inside that dimly lit, wood-heated general store. The room smelled heavy of roasted coffee beans, oiled leather, and salted pork. He bought up his winter supplies with lightning speed. A sack of flour, 20 pounds of sugar, jars of peaches, coffee beans, and a heavy slab of salted bacon. Then he strode toward the back wall where the dry goods hung, pulling down a thick, dark green wool coat. He snatched heavy leather mittens lined with warm rabbit fur, then grabbed a sturdy pair of fleece-lined winter boots. He tossed them on the counter before the clerk. Size 5 for the boots, Ezra said. Eliza stood frozen by the front door. I cannot pay for these things, mister. I do not have a single coin. Didn't ask you to, Ezra said, never glancing her way. He paid the clerk, gathered the gear, and stepped right up to her. He held out that heavy wool coat. Put it on. She hesitated, gripping her carpet bag until her knuckles turned pale white. It was a fine coat, exactly like the ones factory bosses' wives wore back in Chicago. She felt unworthy of such luxury. Worse than that, she felt terrified of the heavy debt she was building. Put it on, Eliza, he said again, his voice leaving no room for debate. She slid her thin arms into the sleeves. You can imagine that warmth hitting her instantly. That heavy wool settled on her shoulders like armor she never knew she desperately needed. They headed out toward the edge of town, right where Ezra's supply wagon was hitched. 2 massive, mean-looking mules stamped their hooves in the freezing mud. The wagon was piled high with crates, tools, and heavy tarps. Ezra climbed easily onto the wooden bench and looked down. That wagon step was a solid 3 feet off the ground. Eliza lifted her boot, tried pulling her own weight up, and felt her weak arms fail. She slid right back into the mud, cheeks burning with shame. Before she could try again, Ezra climbed down off his perch. He put his rough, calloused hands around her waist. His grip was strong enough to break bones, yet surprisingly gentle. He lifted her without effort, setting her safely on the bench. He never said a word, just climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue. Those mules lurched forward, and the wagon began its slow, rattling climb out of Oakhaven. That mountain journey was pure brutality. As they left the valley behind, the muddy trail turned to frozen, solid dirt, and soon enough, deep snow. As the trail climbed higher, the air turned thin and bitterly cold. Wind howled through ancient pines, screaming like some wounded beast. Eliza sat stiff upright on that bench, clutching her worn carpet bag tight against her chest. That bag held her entire world. A spare dress, a wooden comb, and her mother's old Bible. The silence stretched for miles, heavy and suffocating. In her rough life, quiet men meant rising anger and violence soon to follow. She needed to appease him, needed to prove she had some real value. "I can cook." Her voice came out raspy and desperate over the rattling wheels. "I am not much for heavy lifting yet, but I make good stew and can mend clothes. I see your shirt is torn up at the shoulder. I can easily stitch that tonight." Ezra kept his eyes locked on that dangerous mountain trail. "You do not need to sell yourself to me, Eliza. The auction is over." "Then why did you buy me?" she asked, the words ripping out before she could stop them. "You spent a fortune. You want something." "You were freezing," he said. She let out a bitter scoff that triggered a harsh cough. "We know men never buy women just out of kindness." Ezra stayed quiet. That high country wind whipped across the wagon box, and little Eliza's coughing took a wicked turn. It was a wet, heavy rattle tearing right through her ribs, leaving the girl fighting for every scrap of thin mountain air. She hunched over, clutching that wool coat tight against her chest to kill the noise. Figured he'd holler at her for sure. She braced for a backhand and a harsh word, just like those cruel orphanage matrons used to dish out. Instead, Ezra hauled back on the reins. "Whoa," he grumbled. The heavy wagon stopped dead. He climbed down, tying those thick reins right around the brake lever. Eliza's heart hammered like a trapped rabbit as he stomped to the back of the wagon. "He's abandoning me," she figured. She thought he saw how sick she was and aimed to leave her freezing. But he came right back carrying an iron kettle, a canteen, and some dry kindling. He dropped to his knees in the wagon's shadow, using his massive frame to block the gale, and whipped up a small fire. He splashed water into that kettle, settled it deep inside the flames, and just waited. Once it boiled, he dug into a worn leather pouch on his belt, pulling out a healthy pinch of crushed dried leaves. He tossed them in a tin cup and poured the rolling water right over top. Standing up tall, he handed her the steaming brew. "Drink." Eliza took it, her little hands shaking fiercely. She raised it up, breathing in the scent of sharp pine needles and damp earth. It tasted mighty bitter, but the second it went down, a rich, soothing heat spread right through her aching chest. That wicked tearing in her lungs finally backed off. The coughing quieted down. She just stared at him over the edge of that tin cup. Mullein and slippery elm. Ezra muttered, kicking a boot full of dirt over the fire to snuff it out cold. "The natives taught me. Won't cure a thing, but it stops the spasms so you can catch your breath." He snatched the empty cup, tossed it in the wagon bed, and climbed right back up to his bench. He grabbed the reins without demanding a single lick of gratitude. He never laid a hand on her, just did exactly what it took to keep the girl breathing, and kept on driving. Eliza sat back, pulling the heavy coat tighter. She watched his rugged profile as he steered them through that treacherous mountain pass. Make no mistake, he was a terrifying fella, capable of brutal violence. She saw exactly how he handled that slimy auctioneer, yet the huge hands holding those reins were the exact same ones that gently brewed her tea. She closed her eyes, dead tired and mighty confused. And for the first time in a long while, she was completely in the dark about what tomorrow might bring. They pulled in just as the sun sank behind those jagged, snow-capped peaks, throwing the whole mountain into a deep, bruised purple twilight. Now picture this. His cabin sat in a natural clearing tucked against a sheer rock face to block those wicked northern gales. This wasn't some flimsy pioneer shack. It was a downright fortress, built from peeled pine logs thick as a man's waist, perfectly notched and chinked with hardened mud. Even the roof was heavy mountain slate. Ezra halted the wagon by the front door. He tied off the mules and wandered around to her side while Eliza tried climbing down herself. She was dead set on showing some frontier grit. She swung her legs over the timber, but the biting cold had settled deep into her joints. The second her boots hit frozen dirt, her knees gave out. Humiliation burned her worse than the cold. She ate dirt, hard, jarring her teeth. She scrambled to her hands and knees, absolutely terrified to look like a weak tenderfoot. You see, weakness in the city factories got you fired, and on the streets, it got you killed. But Ezra didn't laugh or sigh. The big man just stepped right up, grabbed her firmly by the upper arm, and hauled her straight to her feet. His weathered face was just a mask of practical business. Let's get you inside before you freeze solid. He practically carried her through that oak door. The inside was one massive room. A giant stone hearth swallowed up the far wall, flanked by neat stacks of bone-dry cordwood. A heavy hand-carved oak table sat dead center with two plain chairs. Tucked in one corner was a sturdy timber bed, piled high with trapping furs and thick quilts. Opposite the door sat a much smaller, narrow cot. The whole place was spotless. Not a speck of dust or frontier grime. Just smelled like ancient timber, dried sage, and total isolation. It was bitter cold inside, but perfectly dry. Old Ezra walked straight over to that hearth. He grabbed a handful of shaved kindling, struck a match right against the stone, and coaxed a warm flame to life. Within minutes, those thick oak logs were roaring, and the desperate chill finally broke. Eliza just stood there awkwardly near the middle of the floor. Panic fluttered in the girl's chest like a snared bird. She had to prove she belonged out here. She needed to earn her keep before that quiet mountain man realized he had made a terrible mistake. She spotted a heavy cast-iron skillet resting on the edge of his dining table. She stepped over, figuring she could scrub it or stash it away in the cupboards, but her little hands were still completely dead numb from the trail. The second she lifted it, her frozen fingers failed. That heavy iron slipped free. Let me tell you, it hit those floorboards with a deafening clang that echoed off every single log wall. Eliza flinches hard, throwing her arms up and backing away until her spine hits that rough timber wall. She squeezed her eyes tight. I am sorry. Please, I will clean it up. She braced herself, waiting for the strike. Now you and I know how proud frontiermen were of their goods. She braced herself, expecting a heavy fist across her cheek. She had just dropped his iron cookware. She locked every muscle, holding her breath. Dead silence. Only the popping fire filled that cabin. Trembling like a leaf, Eliza slowly lowered her arms, peeking out through her fingers. Ezra stood near the hearth. No burning face, and his big fists were loose. His face was a stone mask, but his broad shoulders eased down, tension draining away. He walked over slow, heavy boots, thudding softly on those floorboards. He never reached for her. Instead, he bent down, scooped up the iron skillet, checked it over for cracks, and set it gently on the table. Eliza, he said softly. His tone was quiet as a snowfall stripped of the grit she expected. She swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. Yes, sir. Do not call me sir. My name is Ezra. He pulled out a heavy oak chair. Sit down. She obeyed in a heartbeat, sliding into the seat, folding her hands tight in her lap to hide the tremors. Ezra leaned back against the table, studying her. You are waiting for me to hurt you, he stated flatly. It was not a question. Men do not pay $50 for nothing, she whispered, her old cynical armor flaring up. I broke a plate once at the boarding house. The landlord took it out of my hide. I know how this hard world works. Maybe back east that is how it works, Ezra replied, turning his back to hook a heavy iron pot over the hearth fire. Up in these mountains, money is just dirt pulled from the river. It ain't worth a human life. You drop a pan, so be it. Iron does not bleed. No need to cower in my cabin. He let that pot heat. It was leftover stew from the night before. He scooped a hearty portion into a deep tin bowl, grabbed a hunk of hard bread, and set down the steaming food right before her. Then he filled a smaller bowl for himself and took a seat across the table. Eat, he told her. She took a timid bite. It was a hearty stew of venison, root vegetables, and salty broth. It was rich, piping hot, and the finest meal she had tasted in years. Pure hunger conquered her fear. She bolted the food too fast, nearly choking before making herself slow down. Her eyes kept darting his way, waiting for him to snatch the bowl and say she had eaten her share. He never looked up, just quietly worked on his own grub. Once finished, Ezra stood tall and pointed toward the big bed in the corner, piled deep with thick animal furs. You sleep there. Eliza glanced at the bed, then back at the massive mountain man. Where do you sleep? He pointed over to a narrow cot sitting right beside the heavy timber cabin door. She just stared at him, dumbfounded. That cynical shell she had worn for years was fracturing, and it terrified her. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice shaking. Are you some holy man? A saint looking for a stray dog to fix? Ezra just gathered up their empty bowls. He paused, holding her gaze with slate-gray eyes. I am no saint, Eliza. I did things in the war that would turn your stomach. I am just a fellow who likes peace, and a cabin is too damn quiet with nobody else breathing inside. He stepped to the door, dropping a heavy iron bar into place with a loud thunk. Go to sleep, he said, blowing out the table lamp. Tomorrow is a hard day. Eliza lay down on the mattress, keeping her heavy wool coat wrapped tight around her. She pulled the thick furs over her shaking frame. That heavy warmth felt immensely comforting. Out on the mountain, a vicious wind howled, battering hard against those thick log walls. But inside, the fire popped, casting a warm orange glow across the room. She watched the man's huge shadow settle onto that narrow cot by the door. He had deliberately planted himself right between her and the outside world. You and I know what that means. For the first time ever, she was neither shivering nor hiding from a beating. As her weary eyes finally closed, Eliza realized those brutal survival rules from the city alleys might not mean a thing up on this mountain. Morning broke on the frontier, not with a gentle sunrise, but a harsh, blinding glare through frosted glass. Eliza woke to the steady, echoing thud of an axe splitting timber outside. She sat up, thick furs pooling at her waist. Her breath plumed like smoke in the frigid cabin air. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers. Ezra's cot by the door sat empty, his wool blanket folded up with neat military precision. Her lungs ached with a deep, hollow tightness that made every single breath take conscious effort. Pull up a chair, friend. That bone-deep weariness from the auction block had finally faded. For the first time in 3 long years, she didn't wake to a foreman's screaming whistle or the crack of a boss's cane. That cabin's quiet was mighty heavy, plumb heavier than any city racket. Tossing back those thick furs, she shook hard as that frosty dawn cut right through her thin dress. Catching sight of a green wool coat resting on the bedpost, she hauled it on. Swallowed her whole, it did, but that baked-in smell of pine and wood smoke steadied her nerves. Eliza wasn't one to lay about. Back east, staying alive meant making yourself useful before some fella figured you for dead weight. She stepped to the hearth, grabbed up that heavy iron poker, and stirred the ashes. She fed dry shavings into those glowing red coals, blowing soft until a flame sparked, then stacked 3 split logs on top. By the time that front door opened, a roaring blaze had chased the cold right into the corners. Ezra stepped in, hauling a massive armful of oak. Fresh snow dusted his wide shoulders and clung to his dark beard. He didn't act surprised to find her awake, and offered no praise for stoking up that fire. He just dumped that timber in the iron cradle by the hearth and stomped his heavy boots. Pumps froze solid, he grumbled, his voice like rolling thunder. I'll bust some ice down at the creek to melt. Found a tin of oats in the pantry. I can fix porridge, Eliza shot back, quick. And bake up some biscuits, too, assuming you got baking powder. Ezra gave a single nod. Pantry's there. He spun on his heel and left. Eliza got right to work in that chilly little storage alcove. Lord, it held a downright staggering heap of supplies. Sacks of flour, dried beans, hanging slabs of salt pork and preserved berries. Enough grub to keep a whole family alive through a 10-month freeze. She dug out oats flour and a crock of stiff butter, working with a jumpy, frantic energy. Her hands trembled partly from the biting chill, and partly from that desperate need to prove her keep. By the time Ezra hauled in a bucket of creek ice, she had oats boiling away and a pan of lumpy, uneven biscuits baking in his heavy iron Dutch oven. They ate quietly. Them oats lacked flavor, and the biscuits were burnt a little black underneath. Eliza kept her eyes glued to her tin plate, gnawing the burnt crust, just waiting for a scolding. Back east, a landlord would strike you for wasting good flour. Ezra cleared his bowl, wiped his mouth on the back of his hand, and grabbed another biscuit. He cracked it open, paying no mind to the black char, and scooped sweet preserves right onto the hot dough. Oven heat's uneven, he reckoned, chewing slow. Back right corner burns hot. Just spin the pan next time around. And that was all. You and I know what a relief that is. No yelling, just truth. That knot inside Eliza finally loosened. She spent the day finding work. She lacked the strength to chop timber or haul heavy water, and her rough cough acted up fierce out in that cold air. But the girl could mend clothes fine. She dug out an old leather pouch of sewing supplies from a drawer. She took Ezra's spare work shirts, plumb frayed at the collars and busted at the elbows, and settled by the fire. That steady rhythm of pulling a needle through rough cloth brought her comfort. It was solid, undeniable proof she was pulling her weight. Come sundown, Ezra parked himself at that heavy oak table, quietly oiling the parts of his Winchester rifle. He kept a side eye on her, noting how she sat so stiff, with her spine dead straight, how she scrambled up any time he crossed the room, waiting for the boot to drop. You don't gotta earn your keep today, Eliza. He spoke real soft, sliding the bolt of that rifle back home with a sharp, heavy clack. She kept stitching. Idle hands starve. Not under my roof, he said. Her needle stopped dead. She stared at the giant man, his hands slick with gun oil. Nobody buys a person for charity. I'm just waiting for the bill. Ezra set his rifle down, leaning his heavy forearms on the table. Firelight cast deep shadows across his weathered face. I bought you because 50 fellas stared at you like some dying horse. Ezra spoke without a lick of pity, just dealing cold, hard truth. I bought you because I had the gold and they didn't. You owe me nothing. Want to mend shirts? Fine, it helps out. But if you spend this whole winter waiting on a backhand from me, it's going to be a mighty long, miserable season for the both of us. Eliza stared. That cold wall she'd built over 22 years of brutal survival cracked just a fraction more. She didn't say thank you. Words felt too small. She just bowed her head, grabbed her needle, and kept on sewing. Listen here, her shoulders finally dropped. 2 weeks later, that sky turned the color of a bruised plum. Gather round, friend. The temperature plunged so fast those cabin logs popped and groaned sap freezing rock solid inside the timber. The wind didn't just howl, it shrieked. That winter storm struck like a collapsing mountainside. Before long, white drifts buried the cabin windows halfway up, turning the inside into endless, shadowy twilight. They were cut off from the whole world, just two folks trapped in one small room. A fragile spark of heat floating in a frozen, deadly wilderness. Frontier cabin fever started chewing at their minds. That quiet which used to feel peaceful turned heavy enough to crush a man's chest. But this blizzard dragged in a foe worse than boredom. That dead pressure and the icy drafts blowing through the log chinking woke up something awful deep down in Eliza's chest. A simple, dusty cough twisted into a wet, bone-shaking hack. Come day 3 of the whiteout, she was entirely bedridden. Ezra found her balled up under thick pelts, shaking so hard her teeth were rattling. Her face was chalky white, save for a dangerous, angry red fever burning on her cheeks. He checked her brow, and the girl was burning up. "Eliza," he muttered, giving her shoulder a nudge. She just groaned feebly, swatting him away. "Have to get up," she mumbled, staring blankly ahead. "The foreman is gonna dock my wages. Gotta punch the clock." Pure delirium. But Ezra stayed steady. In the Old West, panic kills faster than lead. He went to work with cold, frontier efficiency. Shed his heavy winter duster and rolled his sleeves up. Let me tell you, he pulled a chair close and dropped a snow bucket nearby. He spent 48 straight hours fighting a war against her fading strength. He boiled mullenweed tea until it was pitch black, making her swallow it down one rough spoonful after another. When she started coughing up bloody phlegm, he simply wiped her chin and pushed more brew. He ripped an old linen shirt into rags, soaked them in that melting snow, and held the icy cloth right against her brow and neck. He wrapped her wrists to break the heat. Through the darkest hours, Eliza hollered. That sickness dragged her mind clear back to the gritty Chicago slums. She pleaded with unseen landlords for a few extra days. Wept out loud for a mother gone 10 years now. She wrestled those heavy pelts, swinging at ghosts. "Don't lay hands on me!" she shrieked, kicking the empty air. "Leave me alone!" "I'll pay it." Ezra finally snatched her wrists. His huge, calloused paws wrapped entirely around her fragile arms. He wasn't rough about it, just planted her with the solid weight of a mountain. "Eliza," he ordered. That gravelly voice cut right over the howling blizzard outdoors. "You are up on the mountain. You're safe. Eyes on me." She sucked in air, eyes blown wide in pure terror, staring blind at the timber roof. "Look at me," he barked again, and her wild eyes locked on him. She found those flint-gray eyes, that thick brow, the bone-deep tiredness in his rugged face. The harsh present finally beat back the past. That awful ghost grip let go, and she sank deep into the bedding, crying out her last bit of strength. Ezra didn't waste breath on sweet talk. Mountain men don't make promises they can't keep. He simply lifted the hot rag from her forehead, dunked a fresh strip into the slush, and pressed it right over her fiery skin. "Just sleep," he grumbled softly. When daybreak hit on the 5th morning, the gale finally quit. That heavy, violent roar gave way to a silence so deep it rang in your ears. Eliza blinked awake. The fever was gone. She felt utterly scraped out, frail as a newborn calf, but her skin was finally cool, and her breathing ran clear and steady. She turned to look. Old Ezra was dead asleep in that hard chair by the cot. His chin was buried squarely in his chest. Heavy, bruised shadows hung under his eyes. He looked 10 years older, completely weathered by the long watch. Down on the floor sat 3 empty water buckets and a soggy pile of discarded rag strips. It hit her like a kick from a mule. This hardened, fearsome frontier trapper had stayed up for 2 solid days to yank her out of the grave. She moved a little, the rustling pelts sounding like a gunshot in that quiet shack. Ezra's eyes flared open in a flash. His instincts jerked a hand toward his belt knife before his tired brain caught up. He blinked hard, scrubbing a rough palm down his bearded jaw. He leaned right in, pressing the back of his knuckles to her cheek. His hide was tough as saddle leather, but the touch was surprisingly tender. "Fever is gone," his gravelly voice muttered. "You stayed awake." Eliza croaked, her throat raw. Ezra just slouched back in his chair, stretching those stiff, aching shoulders. "I've put enough folks in the ground, Eliza. No way was I chopping a grave out of frozen dirt if I could help it." She stared into the hearth. "Who did you bury?" It was the absolute first time she ever got the nerve to ask about his history. You and I know he could have ignored her right there, told her to mind her own claim. Instead, he just stared at the embers, his face turning into cold, unreadable stone. "Just men I fought beside," Ezra answered, quiet as a ghost. "Men I fought against at Vicksburg and Antietam. I spent 4 long years watching boys bleed out in the mud for politicians sleeping in warm beds, After the surrender, I couldn't walk a crowded street without smelling copper and rot. The big man stood, grabbing the dirty water bucket. I came up this mountain because the heavy snow covers absolutely everything, he muttered, turning his back to her. Up here, things only die from weakness or carelessness, not because some suited man drew lines on a map. He pushed through the front door to toss the dirty water. Eliza watched his broad back disappear. The truth dawned on her. He never bought her for slavery. He bought her because he refused to watch the world crush another soul like the war crushed his brothers. They were just two quiet refugees, hiding from a world that ate folks alive. Now, you and I know a mountain thaw is pure deception. The sun beat down from a clear sky, turning that peak into a blinding white sea. That snowpack ran 10 feet deep in places, trapping them tight at the old cabin. But the bitterest cold had finally broke. Eliza sat quiet at the heavy oak table, shelling dried pintos into a rusted iron pot. She stayed weak, taking mighty slow steps, but that sickly gray pallor had completely vanished from her skin. For the first time in years, she carried real meat on her bones. Those deep hollows in her cheeks had finally filled out. Wearing that heavy wool coat indoors wasn't required anymore. Ezra sat near the hearth, working a big hunting blade across a wet whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of cold steel felt like a peaceful domestic hymn. Then a dog started barking out yonder. It wasn't no friendly greeting. It was the frantic, aggressive baying of a tracked hunting hound. Ezra froze up. The entire cabin went dead quiet. He laid his knife aside, rose tall, and snatched that Winchester repeater off the mantel in one smooth, practiced motion. He never glanced Eliza's way, but his voice cracked like a bullwhip. Get inside the pantry. Stay hidden. Eliza knew better than to ask questions. Her old street survival instincts flared up. She dropped the pintos, scrambled into that dark alcove, and pulled the heavy door shut, leaving a tiny viewing crack. Someone's heavy fist started pounding on that front door. The solid timber practically rattled. Hello, the cabin. Some raw, gravelly voice hollered out. Ezra checked his rifle's chamber, thumbed back the iron hammer, and stepped toward the entrance. He didn't swing it wide open. He unhooked the latch and pulled the door just enough to block the entire doorway with his massive frame. Standing out there in knee-deep snow were two fellas. They looked dead tired, half frozen, and carried a stench like a month on the trail. One fella held the rope of a vicious, starved hound. The second drifter shoved his way forward. It was Silas Higgins, that wretched trapper from the cattle auction block, a real hardened mountain man. Silas sneered, his sour breath pluming in the freezing air. He looked downright awful. His lips were all busted and bleeding, dark frostbite creeping up his left cheek. Got caught on the high ridge during a whiteout. Lost our mule. We need shelter. Ezra just stared back at him, features carved from solid stone. Listen, folks. Ezra despised Silas, knowing exactly what kind of snake he was. But in this territory, denying shelter after a blizzard is flat-out murder. The Frontier Code demands you show hospitality even to your worst enemies. Drop your iron in the snow, Ezra commanded. No guns come inside my house. Silas spat a bitter curse, but he unbuckled that rig, letting his heavy revolver plunge into the deep snowdrift. The second trapper followed suit. Ezra took a slow step back, keeping his Winchester lowered but deadly ready. Fire is warm. Don't touch a damn thing. Those two stomped inside, dragging the sour funk of unwashed hide-wet wool and cheap chew into the cabin. They rushed straight to the hearth, practically shoving their bare hands into the crackling flames. Through that tiny crack in the pantry door, Eliza watched them. Her scared heart hammered hard against her ribs. She remembered that cold, predatory stare Silas gave her down at the block. That rat bid $5 for her life, chuckling about her dirt-cheap burial cost. The whole cabin suddenly felt entirely too small. Silas turned his back to the roaring fire, warming his cold backside. Those rat-like eyes scanned the tidy room, taking in the neatly stacked firewood and swept floors, and that cast-iron pot of beans sitting on the table. "Cozy little pioneer setup you got here, mountaineer," Silas sneered, pulling a filthy rag to wipe his runny nose. "Didn't think a killer like you could keep house." He paused right there, a mighty cruel grin spreading wide to expose his rotted yellow teeth. "Where's your new cattle? That little sick bird you bought off the auction block. She dead yet?" Ezra tightened his grip on that heavy rifle until his knuckles turned bone white. "Don't speak about her." Silas barked a harsh, grating laugh. "Don't tell me you actually kept that stray alive. Hell, man. $50 for a girl who couldn't even stand up? No, you and I know that was the wrong thing to say." The heavy metallic clack of that Winchester's lever action echoed through the cabin like rolling thunder. Ezra stood still, leveling that steel barrel directly at the bridge of Silas's nose. Now, friend, he didn't raise his voice or shout, but that dead violent stillness in his eyes, it made the other fella freeze solid with absolute terror. "I said," Ezra whispered, his voice humming with pure, lethal intent, "don't speak about her." Tension thick enough to carve with a bowie knife choked that cabin. Silas swallowed hard, slowly raising his hand while his hound rumbled a low growl. The pantry door creaked open. Ezra never took his flinty eyes off Silas, but you could see his jaw clench tight. "Stay back, Eliza," he prayed silently. But she didn't hide. She stepped right out of the shadows. She wasn't hiding inside that oversized wool coat anymore. She wore a clean, simple cotton dress, standing much taller than she ever did back in Oak Haven. Good mountain air and hearty food had built her strength, but that fierce fire burning in her eyes was something entirely new. Perfectly calm, she walked over to the table and picked up a heavy cast-iron skillet. She wasn't cowering behind Ezra today. She marched right up beside that giant of a man, looking Silas dead in the eyes. "I'm alive, Mr. Higgins," Eliza declared. Her voice rang steady and loud, missing every ounce of that fearful tremor from the auction block. "And this is my house. Watch your mouth or go outside and freeze." Old Silas just stared at her, completely and utterly stunned. That frail, dying girl coughing blood into a rag was gone forever. In her place stood a woman wielding an iron pan, backed by a giant with a rifle. Ezra didn't look over, but a slow, grim smile tugged the corner of his mouth beneath that heavy beard. The cattle had grown teeth. "You heard the lady," Ezra said softly. "Sit down. Shut your mouth. And the second those boots thaw, you are off my mountain." That night stretched out like a barbed wire fence humming with tension. Silas and his nameless drifter slept in the hard floorboards by the hearth, pulling their filthy wool coats tight around their heads. The hound lay between them, twitching in its sleep, with an occasional rumbling growl. But Ezra, he didn't sleep a wink. He anchored himself in that heavy oak chair at the head of the table, never bothering to light the oil lamp. He just sat in the dying orange glow of the embers, his Winchester rifle resting across his thighs. Those cold slate eyes never left the two shapes on the floor. He breathed slow and silent through his nose, carefully measuring the rise and fall of their chests. Now across the room in that large bed, Eliza lay wide awake. Staring at the ceiling timbers, her heart thumped a steady, anxious rhythm against her ribs. She kept replaying that fiery moment in her head. "This is my house." Those words had bypassed her mind completely, erupting from a deep, primal frontier spirit she never knew she had. For years, she was just a ghost in other people's spaces. A factory floor, a boarding house cot, a cruel auction block. She'd never owned a single patch of dirt. Yet when Silas threatened this cabin, she staked her claim right then and there. She turned her head, peering over the edge of those heavy furs. Ezra's massive silhouette looked carved right into the darkness. He was guarding her not like a piece of property, but as a true partner in his mountain sanctuary. Let's picture this next part together. When that pale gray dawn bled through the frosted glass, Ezra stood up. The chair scraping sounded like thunder in that quiet cabin. Silas jerked awake. his hand instinctively flying to his empty hip where his six-shooter usually sat. He scrambled up, joints popping, his pale face slick with a greasy sweat. The drifter followed suit, snatching the hound's rope leash. "Boots are thawed," Ezra said. His voice was just a flat, emotionless rasp. "Get out." Silas didn't dare argue. The terrifying stillness of that giant holding a lever-action rifle completely suffocated his false bravado. He grabbed his soaking wet boots, shoving his freezing feet inside without even bothering to lace them up. He practically shoved his partner toward the thick oak door while Ezra threw the heavy iron latch. Ezra pushed the door wide. That biting morning wind swept right in, carrying the sharp scent of pine and raw, bitter cold. Silas stepped out onto the porch. He bent down, digging his frozen revolver out of the deep snowdrift where Ezra made him drop it yesterday. He checked the barrel, shaking the packed snow loose before sliding it back into his holster. Then he looked back at the cabin. His eyes ignored the giant and locked right onto Eliza, who sat up in bed, boldly watching them leave. A nasty sneer returned to Silas's cracked lips. His nighttime terror was fading fast, replaced by the bitter, festering poison of a truly humiliated man. Rich man's game playing house with a corpse. Silas spat his breath, pluming in the freezing air. "Snow's going to melt eventually, mountaineer. Dirt roads wash out. Men get hungry. You got a lot of gold up here, and only one rifle." Ezra didn't raise his weapon. He sure didn't need to. "Listen to me now." He took one slow, deliberate step onto the porch. His sheer physical mass completely eclipsed that morning sun. "If I see your shadow cross that tree line again, Higgins," Ezra said quietly, "I won't bother telling you to drop your iron. Pull up a chair." Silas spat a black stream of tobacco into that clean porch snow, yanked his hound's leash, and trudged off with his shadow trailing close. They melted right into the dark, heavy timber of that lower trail. Ezra eyed that tree line for 10 solid minutes before turning back. He stepped inside, pulled the door shut, and dropped the heavy iron bar. Setting his rifle on the table, he leaned over the wash basin and splashed ice-cold water onto his face. The man looked bone-tired. Eliza swung her legs off the bed, walked to the hearth, and fed some dry kindling to the dying embers. The flames caught, throwing a warm golden glow across the quiet room. "I shouldn't have spoken," Eliza murmured, watching the flames dance. "Yesterday with the pan, I made him mad. I painted a target on us." Ezra dried his face with a rough towel, watching her back. Her spine was dead straight, bracing for a harsh scolding that wasn't coming. "You didn't make him mad." Ezra walked over, breaking down his rifle to clean it. "Men like Higgins are born mad. They hate what they can't break. He saw you stand tall, and it made him feel small. That is his burden." Eliza turned, wringing her hands. "I called it my house. I had no right. You bought the flower. You built these walls. I overstepped." Ezra stopped oiling the barrel of that Winchester and looked up at her. His hard slate eyes met hers, and for the very first time, the heavy iron wall behind them dropped just a single inch. "You defended it," he rumbled. "You didn't hide away. You stepped up and held the line." He tossed the dirty rag on the table. "Wood and mud don't make a home, Eliza. The grit to keep it standing does. You earned your share of these floorboards yesterday." Eliza swallowed hard. That bitter voice in her head, the one calling her a squatter waiting on a harsh eviction, finally went dead quiet. She gave a single nod, turning back to the flames. They never spoke of it again. But as winter started breaking outside, the cold ice inside that little cabin had completely melted away. Now you and I know fall springs hit hard. 10-foot drifts melted into thick slush, turning the mountain into a deadly mudslide. The high creeks, frozen solid all season long, roared back to life. Ezra stood knee-deep in the freezing gorge, swinging his heavy logging axe to chop away a nasty deadfall of ancient pine trees. If that dam burst, floodwaters would wash right through his clearing. The roaring creek was deafening. The big man never even heard the hound coming. A heavy, mud-caked boot kicked the back of his knee. Ezra lost his footing on slick stones, crashing hard into the freezing mountain current. He dragged himself up, freezing water spilling from his clothes, only to find 3 rough men staring down from the high embankment. Silas Higgins stood dead center, aiming a rusted Walker Colt right at the giant's broad chest. On the left was the Blizzard Drifter, gripping a starved, vicious hound by a thick leather strap. On the right was a heavy outlaw holding a double-barreled scattergun. "Road's washed out, mountaineer," Silas hollered over the roaring water with a rotten grin. "Town is starving. We're taking your gold." "Then we're hauling the girl down to the camps." Ezra didn't bargain or beg. He just lunged. He drove his heavy boots into the river stones, launching his massive frame up the slick, muddy bank. Silas's eyes went wide, and he fired. The sharp crack of that Colt echoed hard off the canyon walls. The heavy lead ball tore right through Ezra's shoulder, spraying hot blood across the slush. But the giant never stopped. He slammed into Silas like a runaway rock slide, crashing them both backward into the freezing mud. Ezra clamped his thick, calloused hands right around Silas's throat, driving his heavy thumbs into the trapper's windpipe to crush the miserable life out of him. But the drifter dropped that leash, and the starving hound lunged, sinking its fangs deep into Ezra's forearm. Muscle tore. Ezra grunted, his iron grip breaking. The outlaw stepped up, raising that scattergun to cave his skull in. Now watch closely. A thunderous boom shattered the canyon. It wasn't the shotgun. The outlaw shrieked, dropping his scattergun as his leg just buckled in a sudden red mist. Ezra hurled the bloody hound away and whipped his head around. Standing 50 yards off by the timber line was Eliza. Her long dress was plastered straight to her legs by the freezing wet brush. She held Ezra's heavy Winchester rifle pressed rock solid against her shoulder. She didn't shout any warnings. She just cranked that lever back, ejected the hot smoking brass, and took aim again. The drifter took one look at those cold, unblinking eyes and sprinted blindly into the deep timber. Silas scrambled backward through the slick mud, lunging for his dropped 6-gun. "Fire!" Ezra roared. Eliza squeezed the trigger. The heavy slug slammed right into the mud, just an inch from Silas's grasping hand. He froze, staring up at that smoking barrel, then down at the bleeding giant rising right beside him. Ezra drove his heavy boot square into Silas's ribs. That bone snapped like brittle, dry kindling. Now listen close. Silas crumbled into a pathetic, gasping heap. "Take your friend!" Ezra rasped, his left arm hanging, dead blood dripping from his fingers. "Crawl out of my valley. If I catch you in Oak Haven, I'll gun you down right in the muddy street." Silas knew better than to argue. He hauled that bleeding drifter down the trail, painting a long, crimson smear across the freezing slush. Old Ezra watched them leave until the adrenaline totally washed out. His knees gave way, crashing heavy into the bitter mud. "Ezra!" Eliza cried. She tossed that rifle aside and bolted, sliding through the cold slush to grab hold of his massive shoulders. "Get up!" she gasped out, hauling his good arm over her neck. "You've got to get up! I just can't carry you!" He stared at her face, painted with trail mud and pure frontier grit. Grinding his teeth together, he planted those heavy boots and shoved upward. Leaning all his bulk on her skinny frame, they started that miserable trek home. Inside, their little cabin smelled fiercely of boiling water, hot iron, and scorched cloth. Ezra slumped on the edge of that heavy timber bed, stripped bare down to his waist. His huge chest hitched with short, ragged breaths. That lead ball went clean through the shoulder meat, missing the bone, but leaving an ugly exit wound pouring deep red blood. And that dog bite on his forearm, pure ugly. The skin hung in ragged, bloody flaps. Eliza just stood there, cold as winter ice. That sickly street orphan who used to cough blood in the dark corners was dead and buried. The raw, savage truth of the high country had hammered her into pure steel. She took a strip of clean cloth, soaking it deep in a boiling pot of frontier medicine, mostly yarrow and sticky pine sap. Wringing it dry, she looked right at him. "This is going to burn," she said, steady as rock. Ezra clamped his grip on the mattress edge. Do it. She shoved that scalding rag right into his bullet hole. Ezra's jaw locked up so tight you could hear the teeth grind. The thick muscles in his neck popped out like twisted iron cables, but the giant never made a peep. He did not flinch. He trusted her completely. Eliza worked fast. She scrubbed the grime and blood from his shoulder, bound it up tight in fresh cloth, and turned her sharp eyes to that mangled forearm. Taking a heavy needle and silk thread from his saddlebags, she stitched up his torn flesh. Her hands never even trembled once. Every single stitch was deadly accurate, fueled by a burning need to keep the man whole. Done with her grim work, she tied the knot and stepped away. Her fingers were dyed a deep, rusty crimson. She stared at them for a heartbeat, then marched to the basin, scrubbing hard with bitter lye soap. Ezra watched her from the bed. He studied those tense shoulders, the dirt smudged on her cheek, and the absolute stubborn fire locked in her jaw. You and I both know the feeling. It hit him hard. He was staring at the absolute strongest survivor he had ever met. Most fellas survived the Great War by burying their hearts. Eliza took the crushing weight of the wild frontier and kept her spirit completely intact. You shot a man today, Ezra muttered softly. The hearth fire danced across his ghostly face. Eliza kept scrubbing. He was going to kill you. You could have run. He pushed, desperate to hear the truth out loud. You had the rifle. You had a head start. You could have left me in that mud and just walked away. Eliza slowly dried her stinging hands. She turned around to face him. She did not flinch, and she sure didn't offer no cheap, cowardly excuse. You stayed up 2 solid days wiping sweat from my brow when my lungs quit working. You stood between me and the cold. I don't abandon my debts. The giant slowly stood up. Swallowing the blazing agony in his shoulder, he lumbered over to the heavy oak cabin table. He reached under a loose pine board and hauled out a thick leather sack. Gold clinked heavy against the wood. The snow is finally gone, Eliza, Ezra told her softly. His voice dropped low, shedding that rough frontier grit for something raw and open. The mountain pass is clear. I have 2 mules. This pouch holds enough gold to ride a train clear to San Francisco. You can buy a pretty dress, sleep in a room with real wallpaper. You don't need to freeze up here anymore. Eliza just stared hard at the fortune. Her mind flashed back to that grim auction block. She remembered the sheer, blinding terror of being sold like a ranch animal. She remembered how Ezra slammed a pouch just like that on a barrel, buying her freedom. Slowly, she walked right to the table. She looked from the dirty gold up to the wounded giant standing tall before her. His gray eyes were wide, holding his breath for her choice. He was offering the one thing no man out west ever had a genuine choice. Eliza reached out her hand, but she ignored the gold. Instead, she pressed her palm flat against his wide chest, right over the heart. She felt that slow, heavy drumbeat beating right through his rough bandages. San Francisco is just another city, Eliza whispered. Her voice rang fierce, completely empty of fear. It is just more landlords, more smoke factories, more men looking to buy something. I don't want a room with wallpaper. Ezra's breath hitched. We've all wondered the same thing as he looked down. What do you want, Eliza? I want the mountain, she told him, staring dead into his eyes. I want the quiet. I want the man who didn't laugh when I ate mud. She stepped in close, bridging the gap right then and there. The auction is over, Ezra. You don't own me. I'm staying right here. This is my home, and you are my partner. Old Ezra didn't say a single word. Hell, he didn't need to. He just raised his good right arm, wrapped it around her shoulders, and pulled her close. He buried his weary face in her hair, breathing in the scent of pine timber and the sweet smell of real life. For the first time since that bloody war, the hollow ache inside that mountain man was gone entirely. He just held her tight, knowing the fiercest storm they'd ever ride through was finally behind them. and whatever bitter winter came next, they'd weather it together. Folks, that is the powerful end to Eliza and Ezra's incredible tale. It goes to show you and me that real strength ain't just muscle. The deepest love always burns in the hardest fires. He bought her life, sure, but she ultimately saved his soul. Did this frontier romance strike a chord with you? What was your favorite cabin moment? Leave a comment down below and tell me your thoughts. If you enjoyed this gritty Western journey, hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who appreciates a tough historical romance. And be sure to subscribe for more amazing stories.